My landlord stole $15,000 worth of my belongings and texted me to find a new place. He thought he'd found an easy target. The look on his face when he discovered who he was really dealing with. My name is Marcus Chen, and at 29 years old, I thought I'd seen every dirty trick landlords could pull. Working as a paralegal specializing in tenant rights law for the past 3 years, I'd handled dozens of cases involving predatory landlords. I never imagined I'd become one of those cases myself. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing case files at work. My mother had collapsed at her home in Phoenix and was in the hospital. I needed to leave immediately for what could be weeks of care. My landlord, Rick Morrison, seemed almost too eager to help when I called to let him know I'd be away. "Don't worry about anything, Marcus," he said in that overly friendly tone I should have recognized as a red flag. "I'll keep an eye on your place, maybe do a quick safety inspection while you're gone. You know, check the smoke detectors, look for any maintenance issues." I was distracted, worried about my mother, and stupidly grateful for his apparent concern. I left him a spare key and caught the next flight to Phoenix. What I didn't know was that Rick had been watching me for months, timing my work schedule, noting when I traveled. He thought he'd found the perfect mark, a young man living alone with nice things and no family nearby. Rick had done this before, to at least 3 other tenants in his small portfolio of rental properties. His method was simple: wait for an extended absence, claim unpaid rent or lease violations, remove belongings, and bank on tenants being too intimidated or financially strapped to fight back legally. During those 2 weeks in Phoenix, I was completely focused on my mother's recovery. She'd had a severe stroke, and the doctors weren't sure about her prognosis. I barely thought about my apartment back home, trusting that Rick was keeping an eye on things as promised. I should have been suspicious when he texted me updates like, "Everything looks good at your place, and no problems to report." I returned from Phoenix 2 weeks later to find my apartment completely empty. Everything was gone. My grandmother's antique jewelry, my laptop, my furniture, even my coffee maker. The total value was easily $15,000, but some items were irreplaceable family heirlooms. My grandfather's vintage watch collection, passed down through 3 generations, was worth more to me than everything else combined. My phone buzzed as I stood in my stripped apartment. A text from Rick. "You were behind on rent, had to recover what you owed by selling your stuff. Find a new place to live. Your lease is terminated." I stared at the message in disbelief. I had never been late on rent, not once in the 2 years I'd lived there. In fact, I had always paid a month ahead because I knew my work schedule could be unpredictable. When I called Rick, his tone had completely changed from the helpful neighbor to something cold and dismissive. "Prove you weren't behind," he said smugly. "Show me receipts. Until then, you can take it up with a lawyer if you want to waste your money. Good luck finding one who'll take your case without a retainer you can't afford." He hung up before I could respond. Standing in my empty apartment, Rick probably expected me to cry, to beg, or to simply walk away defeated like his previous victims. He assumed I was just another naive young tenant who didn't understand his rights. He had no idea what he'd just triggered. What Rick didn't know was that I'm a paralegal specializing in tenant rights law. For the past 3 years, I'd worked at Henderson & Associates, a firm that exclusively handles landlord-tenant disputes. I'd seen dozens of cases exactly like this, helped tenants recover hundreds of thousands in damages, and knew every statute and regulation protecting renters. I could recite the illegal eviction statutes from memory. More importantly, Rick wasn't as careful as he thought. Over the past 6 months, I'd been quietly documenting everything about my building and the other tenants. Not because I suspected him specifically, but because tenant advocacy had become second nature to me. I documented everything as a habit. I had noticed things. Mrs. Rodriguez in 2B mentioned her landlord entering without notice. Tom from 3A said Rick had threatened to clear out his apartment when he complained about the broken heater. Sarah in 1C had moved out suddenly after claiming Rick had stolen her security deposit. These weren't just complaints to me. They were potential legal violations I automatically cataloged. I had been building a file on Rick Morrison without even realizing it. Bank records showing consistent on-time rent payments. Photos of my apartment and belongings for insurance purposes. Even recordings of our conversations. Completely legal in our state with single-party consent. I had everything I needed to destroy him. But first I needed to gather more evidence. I spent that first night back making phone calls to the other tenants I'd suspected were victims. Mrs. Rodriguez broke down crying when I told her what happened to me. "He did the same thing to my nephew," she whispered. "Took all his furniture when he was deployed overseas. Said it was for unpaid utilities." Tom was angrier. "That bastard tried to evict me by shutting off my heat in January. When I threatened to call the city, he backed down. But he's been looking for an excuse ever since." Sarah, when I reached her in Oregon, had an even worse story. Rick had not only kept her security deposit, but had also charged her for damages that didn't exist, billing her an additional $3,000. That evening, I made 3 phone calls that would destroy Rick's life. First call, Detective Martinez at the local police department. Within an hour, I had filed a formal complaint for breaking and entering, theft and conversion of personal property. The fact that Rick was my landlord didn't give him the right to remove my belongings without following proper legal procedures. In our state, landlords must provide 30 days written notice and follow specific legal steps before removing tenant property. Second call, my attorney, David Henderson. By morning, we had filed an emergency motion for the return of my property and a temporary restraining order, preventing Rick from disposing of any additional items. David was particularly interested when I told him about the pattern of behavior with other tenants. Third call, the IRS tip line. Because I'd noticed that Rick always insisted on cash rent payments and never provided proper receipts, that suggested he wasn't reporting all his rental income. Tax evasion was a federal crime that could land him in prison. The next morning, Detective Martinez called with interesting news. When police searched Rick's property, they found my belongings stored in his garage. Proof positive of theft, but they also found something else. Items belonging to other tenants he'd evicted using similar tactics. Boxes of personal items labeled with different names and dates going back over 2 years. "This guy's been running a systematic operation," Detective Martinez told me. "We found a notebook where he'd been tracking tenant schedules, noting when people traveled, even recording details about their personal belongings and their estimated value." The investigation expanded quickly. Mrs. Rodriguez came forward with her own story of harassment and illegal entries. Tom provided evidence that Rick had shut off his utilities to force him out. Sarah returned from Oregon with documentation showing Rick had kept her security deposit illegally and had forged receipts for damages that never existed. Within 48 hours, we had 4 separate victims and evidence of a systematic pattern of tenant abuse spanning over 2 years. The local housing authority launched their own investigation. The state attorney general's office opened a consumer fraud case. The FBI was now interested because the pattern suggested interstate mail fraud. Rick's simple, easy target had become a coordinated legal assault involving multiple law enforcement agencies and a potential federal case. Rick tried to backpedal when he realized the scope of what he was facing. He called me frantically, offering to work something out and return my belongings. His voice was panicked, completely different from the smug confidence he'd shown just days before. "Marcus, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he stammered. "Maybe we can resolve this without involving the courts. I'll return your stuff. We'll call it even." "There's no misunderstanding, Rick," I replied calmly. "You committed multiple felonies. The criminal charges are filed, the civil lawsuit is underway, and the tax investigation is beyond either of our control now. But I didn't know you were... if I'd realized you worked in..." He trailed off. "If you'd realized I worked in tenant law, you wouldn't have tried to steal from me?" I asked. So you admit you deliberately target people you think are vulnerable and don't know their rights? The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know. But it was too late for Rick's remorse anyway. The court ordered immediate return of all stolen property. Rick had to pay for professional movers to return everything to my apartment, plus storage fees for the time my belongings were in his possession. The financial penalties were devastating. $10,000 per illegal entry under state tenant protection laws, triple damages for theft of my belongings, $45,000 attorney fees and court costs, $15,000 punitive damages for the pattern of behavior, $50,000 IRS penalties and back taxes, $30,000 plus. Rick's total liability exceeded $150,000, and that was just from my case. The other victims were filing their own lawsuits. The final court hearing was almost anticlimactic. Rick arrived with his third lawyer. The previous two had withdrawn once they understood the evidence against him. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 months. His hair had gone gray and he'd lost significant weight from stress. During the hearing, his attorney tried to argue that Rick had made an honest mistake about my rent status. Judge Harrison wasn't buying it. "Mr. Morrison," the judge said, reviewing the evidence, "the court finds that you engaged in a systematic pattern of tenant harassment, illegal eviction, and theft. The documentation shows this was not a mistake but a deliberate scheme to defraud tenants. This court awards Mr. Chen the full amount of damages requested and orders you to pay all court costs." As we left the courthouse, Rick caught up to me in the parking lot. His earlier arrogance was completely gone, replaced by desperation. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I'd known what you did for a living." I stopped and looked at him directly. "That's exactly the problem, Rick. You didn't see me as a person with rights and legal protections. You saw me as an easy target because I'm young and live alone. You targeted me because you thought I'd be too scared or too poor to fight back. The only thing you're sorry about is that you picked the wrong victim." "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked desperately. "I'm going to lose everything. My properties, my house, maybe even my freedom if the federal charges stick." "You should have thought about that before you decided to become a predator," I replied. "Maybe the next time you own rental property, if there is a next time, you'll treat your tenants with basic human dignity instead of seeing them as potential victims." Rick was forced to sell his remaining rental properties to pay the judgments against him. His real estate license was revoked by the state board after they reviewed the evidence of his fraudulent practices. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of theft and received 2 years of probation plus 500 hours of community service. The other victims received settlements totaling $75,000. Mrs. Rodriguez was able to stay in her apartment with a new property management company that actually followed the law. Tom got his security deposit back plus damages for the illegal utility shutoff. Sarah received compensation for the financial stress Rick had caused. 6 months later, I received a call from a local news station wanting to do a story about tenant rights. The reporter had heard about my case and wanted to highlight how tenants could protect themselves from predatory landlords. During the interview, I made one point very clear. Landlords like Rick count on tenants not knowing their rights or being too intimidated to fight back. But the law protects tenants for a reason. If you're being illegally evicted, having your belongings stolen, or being harassed by your landlord, document everything and get legal help immediately. Don't let them make you feel powerless. The story ran during prime time and generated dozens of calls to our law firm from tenants facing similar situations. We ended up taking on 3 more cases involving systematic landlord fraud, all inspired by people who saw my interview. Rick Morrison's predatory behavior had inadvertently created a network of protection for future victims. His downfall became a cautionary tale that other predatory landlords would remember before targeting vulnerable tenants. As for me, I kept living in the same apartment for another year before finally buying my own place. The new property management company was professional and respectful. I never had another problem with illegal entries, harassment, or any other violations of my tenant rights. Rick had taught me an important lesson. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's making sure the person who wronged you never has the opportunity to hurt anyone else again. And every time I looked at my grandfather's vintage watch collection, safely back where it belonged, I smiled knowing that one predatory landlord had learned that lesson the hard way. The look on Rick's face when he discovered who he was really dealing with? Pure terror, followed by the crushing realization that his easy target had just become his worst nightmare.